It sounds very simplistic to say it, but psychology really can be summed up in terms of two directions, or the movement that can take place in the one direction or the other. So it sounds very simplistic, but it actually works out very well to use it as a kind of a basic model. One direction is the direction of moving towards wholeness, or into the direction of becoming more whole. And the other direction is the complementary direction of becoming less whole, of becoming more fragmented. So when we move away from wholeness, we move, of course, into fragmentation. And the thing about fragmentation, or the fragmented modality of existence, is that it doesn't know itself to be fragmented. If I knew that my perception of myself was a fragment, a kind of little splinter or something, not the whole story, only a very small part of the story, if anything at all, really, then if I knew that I was fragmented, I'd be whole. Because that means that I have a wider frame of reference than the fragmentation-based frame of reference. So I know I'm fragmented. So that's not the same at all. I've already started moving in the direction of wholeness in that case. Which is why Krishnamurti says the seeing is the doing. No matter what I do, whatever I do, it increases my fragmentation. So all purposeful doing increases fragmentation, because all purposeful doing comes out of a very narrow, very limited model of reality, and it extends that. The biggest possible model of reality, if we can say that, isn't a model of reality. It's not a model of reality in the sense that it's made up of uncertainty. It's like an open door. So it's not really a model, it's uncertainty. But uncertainty is the biggest picture, because all the missing parts can come into that, because we haven't made assumptions as to what is a missing part and what isn't. Implicit assumptions, that is. So the state of fragmentation is a state where we're fragmented from our own awareness. Awareness isn't fragmented, because awareness doesn't have any intrinsic limits. Awareness is awareness of everything equally. The rational mind sets up a house where some things are designated true, some things are not designated as anything, but ignored as being random noise or error. So this situation of being a fragment but not knowing it is our usual situation. And we could refer to this fragmented type of sense that we have of who we are as being the self-construct or ego. And I apologize for stating the obvious, but I'm just joining up the dots. We move in the direction of increasing wholeness. This is the same as moving away from the ego fragment. And moving away from the ego fragment really means seeing the world in a bigger way than this ego fragment can. So we're using some other frame of reference other than the rational mind's frame of reference. And so what that means is we're not really moving away from it. We're not really moving away from the ego fragment, because that fragmentation never really existed. We create these fragmentations or the fragmented state with our thinking, because thinking fragments, it draws boundaries, it draws lines between this and that. So what we're really doing, we're not actually moving, but because we've got a wider frame of reference, so to speak, speaking in a fairly loose way, because we've got a broader sweep of perspective, would be a better way of putting it, we can actually see the fragment as being a fragment. And as soon as we see the fragment as being a fragment, we necessarily disidentify from that fragment, because it's only a thing. It's only just an artifact, a construct. So as soon as we see that, we're separate from it. We'll no longer see it as being who we are. Now, this means that as we move in the direction of increasing wholeness and away from the perception of the fragment as being not a fragment but a wholeness in itself, the first thing that we come across is fear. So very simply, movement in the direction of increasing wholeness corresponds to fear, or it invokes fear straight away. And the point of saying that is that when we feel fear, which is felt on the basis of the ego fragment, we resist. Fear translates instantaneously into resistance. We dig in, we get entrenched, we hold on tighter. We're holding on tight already, but we hold on even tighter. We're holding on really, 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 really tight, and our knuckles are going really white. So what we're basically doing with our holding on, with our controlling, with our strategizing, with our resistance, our entrenching type behavior, is that we're trying to go the opposite direction. We've suddenly inadvertently become aware of the possibility that there is this direction of moving in the direction of increased wholeness, which translates into fear, which translates into resistance. And that resistance is us trying as hard as we can to move in the direction of fragmentation. Of course, we don't see it as the direction of fragmentation. We'd have to be aware to see that. And we're moving in the direction away from awareness. We're running away from awareness. We're running away from the broader sweep of perspective. Because this broader sweep of perspective shows up the ego fragment for being an ego fragment, and then we cannot identify with it anymore. We cannot use it as a basis for saying this is who I am, and this is what the universe is in relation to this basis that I have assumed. So in order to have a positive world, a defined world, I need a fixed, limited basis to say this is who I am, and that straight away defines the world that I live in terms of who I've said I am. So although we've got subject and object there, we've got self and other, actually we can see that from that we can see that the world is nothing else than the limits of perception that are inherent in the self-construct in the first place. And seeing as the self-construct is nothing but a set of limitations, which is perceived invertedly to be an actual positive entity or agency or thing, it's clear that the set of limitations, which is the self-construct, and these limitations of perception that are reflected back at us, they're the same thing. So the self doesn't see the world that it relates to and constructs itself in relation to as being itself, which should be a very uncomfortable awareness to have. It should be a very panicky, claustrophobic type of awareness to have. It doesn't have that awareness there. It perceives there to be two different things there, unrelated things. So that's what we see when we move in the direction away from wholeness. We see everything in a deluded way. And we are very, very keen indeed to hang on to these delusions, which is why we're resisting the movement towards wholeness so much. And that's the story of our lives, really. It's one long battle. Generally speaking, I suppose it's true to say that most of us won't find this a particularly inspiring way of looking at what we're doing or what our everyday psychology is. And that's fair enough. That's easy to appreciate why we would feel that. But nevertheless, everyday psychology is all about struggling and fighting and trying very hard not to move in the direction of increasing wholeness, which is the direction of growth. Because growth involves seeing through the game that we're playing, or seeing through the identity which we have claimed to be us, or which we believe to be us. The very essence of fear, stepping into a bigger reality and losing my fictional identity, which only belongs in the unconscious world of thought creative fragmentation, in that bigger reality, the bigger reality without boundaries, fragmentation, which is the reality that hasn't been created by thought. It's the reality that's there already. So we can say just a couple things very quickly about the kind of relationship between the two types of movement, which is in a way the one is the mirror image of the other. So the movement away from wholeness is a compulsive way. We're compelled to run away. Fear compels us, or when we act on fear, then we are compelled. So that's one thing we can say about it. It's unfree. We do it because we have to. We do it because we're afraid not to do it. So we move in this direction out of fear. But the twist is that in this modality, because we've identified with the ego fragment, the fear is actually experienced as our true volition. It's not that I'm being operated on by an external mechanical force, but that I really, really am in charge of this whole business of resisting, this whole business of entrenching, this whole business of running away as fast as I can from the bigger picture, which I don't see as the bigger picture. I see as being a threat that I'm not even going to think about that much. I just know it's a threat. It's a bad thing. That's all we need to know. There's something terrible, terrifying there. So I'm going to run away from it. That's all I need to know. My effort goes into the running away more than the philosophical observation or reflection or examination of what it is that I'm afraid of. All my energy goes into resistance, which I perceive as being me being in control and doing what I want to do. And that's the modality which the everyday self exists in. All of its purposeful activities are dedicated, though we don't know it. That's the implicit story of what's going on. The explicit story is X, Y, and Z. What's really going on is that I'm trying to run away from wholeness. So whenever I orientate myself towards goals or my purposes, I'm running away from wholeness, because there's no way that chasing a goal or trying to enact a purpose can ever bring me closer to wholeness, as I said earlier. But what's happening here is that my goals are acting as a false sort of wholeness. My goals are manifesting as wholeness, because they're saying once you achieve me, you've achieved everything. Now, they're not saying that directly because it sounds stupid, but that's the feeling, that's the excitement, the passion that goes with it. Once I've achieved this goal, then that's my gateway to everything. Therefore, the goal is mimicking wholeness. It doesn't. In order to believe in the goal as being a thing, as being important or meaningful, you have to narrow our attention right down for that goal to become meaningful, for it to become a thing. So then when I've done that, the goal is meaningful, but I have to end up living in a world that is created by my own narrowness, that I've narrowed my awareness down to believe in the goal so that I can have the possibility of playing this game, of moving towards the goal and believing that I'm moving towards wholeness when I'm not. But the price of that is that I can carry on obtaining security from that illusion, but I've moved into a situation where I am being manipulated and controlled by these projections that I can't see to be projections. These delusions that I can't seem to be delusions are the basis for my life, the basis for my thinking, the basis for my orientation to everything. It's all based on delusion. The delusion of goals as being something that they're not, the delusion of the ego fragment being something that it isn't. So in as much as most of our lives, and everyone will probably agree with this, is that the main feature of that we kind of relate to is our purposeful or deliberate action, our goal-orientated action. And that's where we see, that's the juice of it, the meat of it, that's what we're really all about. And we see that as being progressive and empowering, and a way of expressing ourselves and reaching out and all the rest of it, exploring the world. But really, number one, it's not a way of reaching out, but a way of running away. Two, it's not us doing it. We're being manipulated by fear, and fear is also manipulating us into thinking we're not being manipulated. And we're actually traveling in a direction which isn't a direction. There's no such thing as the direction towards increasing fragmentation, because there's no such thing as fragmentation. And yet at the same time, in pragmatic terms, this is the direction which we're all traveling in, or trying to travel in. And in our minds, we can be successful, and then that feels good. But what we feel we're being successful in doesn't exist. That's just a fantasy. There is no way to move away from wholeness. But in a certain sort of way, it seems to us that that's what we're doing, even though we wouldn't spell it out to ourselves in that way. We just feel a kind of a safeness or a security that isn't really there, that comes from identifying with the ego construct. So the attractor in this case is the false wholeness of our goals, the false reality of the self which is seeking those goals. And it's all involuntary, and it all appears to be voluntary or volitional. So it's all a bit of a farce, really. And it all comes to nothing in the end. So that's the story of mechanical life in a nutshell. But then the other direction, which we could also say is the direction towards health, because health comes from the same word as wholeness. It means the same thing. That's what mental health is wholeness, and not being fragmented without realizing that we're fragmented. So the movement in the other direction is not volitional. In other words, it can't come about as a result of purposes or goals or strategies. That's the confusing point. That's where we always get confused. You get this notion of either rational or purposeful therapy, or activity that is guided by the mind, guided by a fragmentation creating thought process. Actually, the movement in the direction of increasing wholeness is not volitional. It's not on purpose. There's no tricks to it. There's no way to get it to happen because we want it to happen. And yet that is the movement into increasing mental health as well. It's also the movement into wholeness. Nothing at all we can do to go in that direction. We can only travel in the direction of, on purpose, we can only deliberately travel in the direction of moving towards increasing fragmentation, which is a direction that doesn't really exist. But in our imaginations it does exist, and in our imaginations we are getting somewhere real by exerting control. Control is a meaningful thing. And the failure to control is meaningful as well. That means we're failures. Now, of course, control seems like a meaningful thing. I wouldn't spend my whole life trying to control if I could clearly perceive that it's meaningless. And I don't mean control in the physical world where it is appropriate, such as I might get a bunch of sticks, pieces of wood, throw them together and make a fire on purpose. That's control. and that's legitimate in the outside world. Psychologically, it is not legitimate because it's just delusion perpetuating and propagating itself when we're talking about the psychological world. And yet the movement towards wholeness, even though it can't be done on purpose, is always happening. We're always moving towards wholeness. It's the only place to move to. And even our intense efforts to move in the opposite direction ultimately only bring us closer to wholeness, as the mystics have said. And the reason for this is that the more we pursue traveling in the direction of increasing fragmentation, which we don't see as much, the more pain there is. The pain of isolation, the pain of alienation, the pain of being separate from everything, the pain of being narrow, the pain of being superficial. And that pain that comes about from our separation from what really matters to us and who we really are and what's really real, that pain brings us back to that, because the pain reminds us in a very insistent, a very thorough way of what we have lost. And when we experience the pain of loss consciously, that reconnects us to what we have lost. When we see that we are fragmented or have become fragmented, then we are no longer fragmented. As Krishnamurti says. Okay, thanks for watching.